with many teachers and principals across New Zealand.
I call Tracey Martin.
Thank you, Mr Chair. So I want to address the $11 billion that the National Government continues to tell the New Zealand public that there's never been more funding for education before because it's now at $11 billion. And so in this budget there is, they're quite right, $10,792,273 million. That's right, absolutely right. What that don't tell you, unfortunately, is that in 2008 the budget was $91,279,000. $700,000 difference over a 9-year period. Now, and you might say $700,000 different. No, sorry, $701 million different. You might say, wow, that's amazing. Let's just be clear. In 2009, Anne Tolley put a price on leaky schools. The Minister has just mentioned leaky schools. Because it's important, when this government says $11 billion in education, the suggestion is that that's being spent on children. The suggestion is that that is directly impacting the education of children, whether that be in more resources, whether that be in more teaching staff, whether that be in lowering class sizes. Now, we know that that's not true. So where is that $701 million going? The price tag put on leaky schools, and let's remember who created the leaky building controversy, the price tag put on leaky schools is $1.5 billion. So the increase that this government is telling the New Zealand public about, wow, we put this much more money into, is going into property. But it's not just going into the taxpayers' property. For example, there is $61,600,000 has gone to private property of integrated schools. That's assets owned by the private proprietors of integrated schools. $61,600,000 of this $11 billion has gone to those private assets. Let's just talk about the fact that this is one of the largest private ECE providers in New Zealand. Their profit before financial costs went up by 121% in the last financial year. This budget that we're talking about, 82% of their business is government business. So this private company had a 121% increase in profit because 82% of their money that creates this profit comes from the taxpayer, the taxpayers of New Zealand, out of this $11 billion. They had an increase of they had a profit margin of $32.9 million. Now, this is why it's important. It's not just worthy, New Zealand, of don't accept when backbenchers of this government say we put in $11 billion. Find out where that money is going. Let's also be clear. So $16,824,000 was spent on advice to the Minister. That's an increase of $5 million in this budget alone. $1,624,628 was spent on property. $34 million was spent on services other than policy to the Minister. $761 million was spent on capital expenditure directly for the ministry, not for a school. Directly for a ministry. That's what's in this budget. $4,638,000 was actually to set up the Education Council. Now, what's interesting about that is that cost is now going to be shifted by this government onto teachers. So this government set up the Education Council. We had the Teachers' Council, but we wanted to remove the voting rights of teachers to have their own representatives there. So the government set up the Education Council for $4,638,000, and that will run out, and that's going to have to be paid for by the teaching staff of New Zealand with like 100-something% increase in their actual fees to join that organisation, which they must join that organisation. Let's also not forget the cuts that were made by this government in 2009 before they started to build them back up again. So New Zealand, you need to look backward before you decide to accept or swallow the information that is being given to you. I'm going to be seeking a second call, sir. Mr. Chair.
Tracey Martin.
Thank you very much. The other reason why, and it's very interesting, this is an article that is from the 1st of April 2017, and why it actually works into this debate, sir, is that in Parliament, this is a quote from this article, the figures don't add up. This is a quote from this article. In Parliament media releases and news reports, the Minister, that was then Minister Hekia Parata, stated that funding for schooling or vote education has increased by 35% since 2008. The Minister, sorry, that was Todd Barclay, if anybody's listening, that shouted out, "That's right." Now, the Minister later confirmed what many had assumed. Her figures included everything in the education budget, not just what schools receive. The 35% includes everything from ministry consultants to IES, charter schools, rolling out of national standards and school rebuilds and construction. So let's be clear. Do not swallow. Well, let's talk about charter schools. Let's talk about charter schools and the report that came through. So this is an article from the 2nd of May, which refers to the $14 million that has been spent out of that budget on charter schools. And the comment from the Vanguard Chief Executive Nick Hyde, when he had to justify why $309,391 in 1 year was taken away from that educational dollar to fund the over and above its payment to its principal for management services. Now, he said that splitting that payment off to their management services, e.g. the company that he and his father had run before charter schools ever arrived, by splitting that amount of money off, it led to further success, which included 100% NCA level level 2 pass rate. Let's read the report that was at the Select Committee from the Ministry. We note a discrepancy between how partnership schools report on their NCEA results compared with other schools. We asked why the reporting differs for partnership schools. We heard that this was a technical issue. The Ministry is investigating how to address it to provide a transparent and accurate picture of pass rates. At present, partnership schools only know if a student has left school and not whether they have left the education system. This means that partnership schools may incorrectly be counting a student as passing NCEA. What that says is there is no way to prove what they're talking about. And what's even a greater concern is when a state school, and I've known 3 of them, that have reported 100% NCEA level pass rate, instantly ERO goes in and does an investigation. How come not with a charter school? How come with a charter school we accept, or we're supposed to accept through a glossy brochure, these schools are funded to $14 million by the taxpayer, we're supposed to accept on face value, and the Minister Parata and David Seymour stood up and lauded that in this House. Let's also just remember that so far of the original charter schools that are still open, around $10 million alone came out of this budget for those charter schools. But what about the whangaruru money? We've still seen no recovery here. So whangaruru, the Ministry of Education estimated that, it was from an article in 2016, that the cost of whangaruru school was $5.2 million. The farm itself, paid for by taxpayers' dollars, was $1.38 million. And the Minister, Parata, stood up in this House and said that the Ministry of Education was negotiating. Where are those negotiations, Minister? Where are those negotiations at to get back either the $5.2 million originally funded for Whangaruru School, the $1.38 million that was used to purchase land or buildings, or even get back the land for the New Zealand taxpayer? But we have never heard, and we're supposed to swallow quietly, that this government is funding education appropriately when it squanders money. It squanders money that is needed, and the worst thing is the cut of $42,908, the appropriation provided to service individuals with special education and special needs. And that was a cut from the last budget to this budget, $42 million. The very children that we know at the Education and Science Select Committee need the greatest support. And yet inside this appropriation, there is a cut.
I call Todd Barclay.